He took everything in the divorce until the judge read the hidden clause in my prenup. The room went silent. Papers shuffled. My heart raced, and across from me he smirked, so sure he had already won. He thought I was powerless. He thought I was finished. But hidden in those pages was a single sentence, one that would turn his victory into his downfall. And to understand how we got there, I have to take you back to the very beginning. He took everything in the divorce until the judge read the hidden clause in my prenup. That single moment, the silence in the courtroom, the stunned faces, the look of panic flickering across his eyes, wasn't the start of my story. It was the climax of years of quiet battles, swallowed pride, and illusions that unraveled thread by thread. To understand how we arrived there, you need to know where it began, because it didn't start in a courthouse. It started in what looked, at first, like a fairy tale. 3 years earlier, I was living a modest life that often felt invisible to the world. My name is Sarah. I was a high school teacher, pouring myself into lesson plans and grading stacks of essays that sometimes felt taller than me. My paycheck barely covered rent for a one-bedroom apartment with peeling paint on the walls and a car that coughed and groaned every winter morning as though it resented being asked to start. My closet was full of plain clothes I wore until the seams gave out, and my weekends were usually spent at thrift shops or planning lessons at my kitchen table. But even with all its smallness, my life wasn't empty. I loved teaching. I loved the way a shy student would finally lift their hand with confidence, or how a struggling kid's eyes would light up when a concept finally clicked. Those moments gave me a purpose that money couldn't measure. Still, there were quiet nights when I'd lie awake staring at the ceiling, wondering if this was it, if my life would always be so ordinary, so predictable, so safe. Then came Marcus. I met him at a charity gala, a glittering event that felt worlds away from my reality. I never would have attended on my own. It was a fellow teacher who begged me, "Come on, Sarah, it'll be fun. Free food, music, maybe even some dancing. What's the worst that could happen?" I didn't own a dress that fit the occasion, so I borrowed one from a friend. It was slightly too big, the zipper caught halfway up, and the heels I wore pinched my toes. I remember standing under those chandeliers, the music swelling. Around me, surrounded by people who looked like they belonged in glossy magazines, and all I wanted was to vanish into the wallpaper. That's when I noticed him, Marcus Chen. He didn't just stand out because of his expensive suit or his height. He stood out because of the way he carried himself, shoulders relaxed, chin lifted, a kind of magnetic confidence that drew people toward him as though he were the sun and they were planets caught in his orbit. I remember thinking, men like that don't even see women like me. But then he did. He walked straight toward me, his smile warm and perfectly timed. "Would you like a drink?" he asked. I muttered something about preferring water, half expecting a laugh, but he surprised me. He ordered sparkling water with lime for both of us. Then he leaned in, eyes sharp yet kind, and said, "You look like you'd rather be anywhere but here." And just like that, the wall I had built around myself cracked. We talked for hours about teaching, about books, about faraway places I only ever dreamed of visiting. He asked questions, leaned in when I spoke, and listened with an intensity that made me feel like the most interesting person in that glittering room. When the night ended, I floated home, replaying every moment in my head, scolding myself not to get carried away. But the very next day, my phone rang. It was Marcus, and then the day after, and the day after that. Soon, my quiet little life wasn't quiet anymore. Marcus swept me into a world I didn't recognize. Dinners at restaurants where the menus had no prices. Weekend trips to places I'd only seen in travel magazines. Flowers delivered to my classroom, which made my students whisper and giggle, "Miss Sarah's got a rich boyfriend." He bought me dresses and jewelry I'd never dreamed of owning. I grew up watching my parents count pennies and stretch groceries until payday. So all of this felt intoxicating, surreal like stepping into someone else's life. For once, I wasn't worrying about overdue bills or whether my old car would survive another winter. For once, I felt chosen. 6 months later, he proposed, on a rooftop with the city skyline glittering behind him, candles glowing in glass jars, and a string quartet playing softly. When he knelt down and opened the velvet box, the diamond inside seemed so large it caught the stars themselves. My hand shook, my breath caught in my throat. I didn't just gasp at the ring. I gasped at the idea that a man like Marcus wanted me. I said yes. Of course, I said yes. Everyone congratulated me like I had won the lottery. You're so lucky, they said. Has perfect, handsome, successful comes from money. What more could you ask for? For a while, it did feel perfect. The wedding was a lavish affair, the kind that leaves guests whispering for months. The honeymoon was paradise. We looked like the dream couple people envied. But real life doesn't stay a dream forever. The first cracks appeared as tiny, almost invisible linnets, so small I could have brushed them off if I hadn't been paying attention. It started with how he spoke about my job. At first, it sounded playful, a harmless tease about the hours I spent grading papers, a chuckle about how cute it was that I wanted to make a difference. But the jokes sharpened. Oh, Sarah's just a teacher, he'd say at parties when people asked about my work. Keeps her busy while I handle the real stuff. His tone made the word just feel like a knife. I'll never forget one dinner party we hosted, filled with lawyers, bankers, and CEOs. The conversation turned to investments and international markets topics that made me feel out of my depth. Still, I tried. I offered a thought I'd read in the news that morning. Before I could even finish, Marcus chuckled, patted my arm, and said, "Sweetheart, let the adults talk." The table erupted in polite laughter. My face burned, but I forced a smile, excused myself, and hid in the kitchen, blinking back hot tears. In that moment, I felt myself shrink smaller than I ever thought possible, like I was disappearing inside my own marriage. But Marcus always knew how to patch over the cracks. The very next day, a new bracelet, a surprise weekend trip. He had a way of burying my pain under gifts, so sparkly they almost blinded me to the hurt. And I told myself maybe I was being too sensitive. Maybe I should laugh it off. Maybe this was what love looked like when reality set in. Through it all, I clung to the memory of my father's words. He had passed away not long before I met Marcus, and the loss was still raw. My father wasn't wealthy, but he was steady. His hands were rough, his shirts oil-stained, but he built a life on honesty and heart. He always told me, "Sarah, your worth isn't in your bank account or the car you drive. Your worth is who you are when no one else is watching." I whispered those words to myself whenever Marcus' comments cut too deep. I convinced myself he loved me in his own way, that he was just different from my father, that it didn't mean he didn't care. But deep down, I felt it. The shift. The man who once made me feel like a princess was slowly turning me into a servant in my own life, quiet, obedient, grateful, just to be chosen. And the truth? I let him, because I thought that was love. What I didn't realize then was that the fairy tale I clung to was only a stage play, and soon the curtain would fall. The cracks in our marriage weren't just cracks, they were fractures, splitting deeper with every laugh at my expense. And those fractures would lead me straight into a darkness I never imagined, because Marcus's cruelty hadn't even begun. The cracks in our marriage weren't just cracks, they were fractures, and once they appeared, I couldn't patch them over with excuses anymore. At first, I tried. I told myself Marcus was working harder because success demanded sacrifice. That the late nights at the office, the surprise business trips, the client dinners that seemed to multiply out of nowhere were all signs of his dedication, not warnings of something darker. I would sit at home with my papers spread across the kitchen table, red pen in hand, reheating leftovers in the microwave, convincing myself that this was what it meant to be married to a successful man. This was normal. This was what I had signed up for. But the truth crept in like a draft through a cracked window, subtle at first but impossible to ignore once it touched my skin. The truth was in the way his smile no longer reached his eyes when he came through the door, the way his kisses brushed my cheek like a chore to check off before he escaped upstairs to his study, the way he no longer asked about my day, no longer remembered my stories, no longer laughed at the little things that once connected us. I tried to hold on. I told him about my students, about the shy girl who finally raised her hand in class, about the boy who turned in his first essay without stains or scribbles, and Marcus would nod absently, eyes fixed on his phone. That phone became my rival. It buzzed constantly, flashing with messages, pulling him away even as he sat beside me. When I asked who it was, he would shrug, voice flat. just work. But I noticed how quickly he snatched it up, how his voice dropped when he answered in another room, the door closing behind him. I wanted to believe the best. I told myself maybe he was protecting me from the stress of business, that maybe he thought I didn't need to know the details. But deep down, I felt it, the shift, the slow suffocation of something that had once felt like love. One night, everything changed. I came home late after a long parent-teacher conference. Exhausted but proud, I carried with me the story of a breakthrough with a struggling studenta moment that reminded me why I loved my job. I walked into the house eager to share it, hoping it would spark some warmth between us again. The study door was cracked open. I heard his laughter. For a moment, I smiled. It had been so long since I'd heard him laugh like that. Maybe, just maybe, things weren't as bad as I thought. Then his words hit me like ice water poured over my head. "Trust me, David," he said, his tone dripping arrogance. "She has no idea. She's so naive. It's almost cute. She actually thinks I married her for love." I froze in the hallway, the sound of my heart pounding so loud I was sure he could hear it. He laughed again, that cruel, sharp laugh that once charmed me, but now sounded like a blade. "Of course I have a prenup. Do you think I'm stupid? When we divorce, she'll get nothing. I'll keep everything, including that property her father left her." She signed it over as collateral without even realizing what it meant. My stomach dropped. The hallway tilted beneath me. My hands went numb against the doorframe. On the other end of the line, his friend must have replied, because Marcus laughed even harder. "You're right. I should get an award for this performance. 3 years of pretending to love someone so boring, so ordinary, but it'll all be worth it when I cash out." Cash out. That's what he called it. Our marriage, my life, my love. Just a transaction. I backed away from the door as though it were on fire. My legs trembled, my body cold, my vision blurred with tears I couldn't hold back. I wanted to storm in, to throw the door open, to scream at him for every lie, every kiss, every whispered promise, but I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't process that the man I had trusted, the man I had promised forever to, had been playing me all along. That night, I lay in bed beside him. I stared at the ceiling while he slept peacefully, his breathing steady, as though the poison he had poured into my life was nothing more than a joke to him. He didn't stir. He didn't know. His mask had slipped, but only for me, and I saw the truth uglier than I ever imagined. The next morning, he kissed my forehead before leaving for work, his voice soft, almost tender. "Have a good day at school, sweetheart." If I hadn't heard that call, I might have believed him. That was the most terrifying part, how easily I could still have believed. I called in sick. There was no way I could face my students with my heart in pieces. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table surrounded by documents I had never truly read: mortgage papers, bank statements, insurance forms, pages I had signed without question because Marcus told me they were routine. My hands shook as I combed through them, and with every word I understood, my horror deepened. The house, not in my name. My father's land, used as collateral, tied up in the mortgage Marcus controlled. The accounts, structured so he had full authority, while I needed his approval for anything significant. I had signed over power without even realizing it. Marcus hadn't just been planning a divorce. He had been planning my downfall from the start. I thought back to the night we signed the prenup. I was blinded by love, by the promise of security, by the glitter of his smile. He told me it was a formality, protection for both of us. I barely read it. He slid the papers across the table, kissed me on the cheek, and said, "It's nothing to worry about." But now I understood it was everything to worry about. For the first time, rage replaced fear. I realized Marcus had never seen me as a partner. I was a pawn, a naive teacher he could control, manipulate, and discard when it suited him. My hands shook with fury, the urge to march into his office and throw the truth in his face nearly unbearable. But then a voice inside whispered, "Be smart, don't let him know, not yet." That voice saved me, because a week later, Marcus came home with flowers and a bottle of wine. His sudden warmth, his affectionate kisses, his gentle questions about my day weren't love, they were strategy, and I knew it. After dinner, he sat beside me on the couch, took my hands in his, and sighed with the heavy air of a man carrying a burden. Sarah, we need to talk. My stomach tightened, but I kept my face calm. About what? About us? He said, his tone rehearsed. I think we both know this marriage isn't working. We've grown apart. It would be better for both of us if we ended things now. He said it so calmly, so reasonably, as though he were doing me a favor. You want a divorce? I whispered. He nodded, brushing his thumb over my knuckles like a mockery of tenderness. Yes, I've already spoken to my lawyer. We can make this quick and painless. You won't have to worry about legal fees or anything complicated. How generous, I murmured, forcing my voice to stay steady. Unbothered, he pulled a manila folder from his briefcase and set it on the coffee table. These are the papers. It's all straightforward. You'll get enough money to start fresh, maybe rent a nice apartment, go back to school if you want, and I'll take care of the rest. It really is the best option for both of us. My hands trembled as I flipped through the pages. Even through the dense legal jargon, the meaning was clear. He was offering me scraps, just enough to survive. He would keep the house, the cars, the investments, and yes, my father's land. According to his settlement, the land would be sold to cover the marital debt tied to the mortgage, and any proceeds would go to him as compensation for his financial contributions. In other words, I was about to lose the last piece of my father I had left. My chest burned with rage. I wanted to scream, to claw the smug satisfaction from his face, but instead I closed the folder slowly, looked at him, and forced a smile. I'll need some time to think. His smile faltered just slightly, but he nodded. Of course, sweetheart, take all the time you need, but my lawyer says the sooner we file, the easier it will be. That night, after he fell asleep, I sat under the dim kitchen light and read every word of those divorce papers. My eyes blurred with exhaustion, but I read them again and again, and for the first time in weeks, I felt something stronger than fear. I felt resolve. Marcus thought I would sign my life away quietly. He thought I was too weak, too naive to fight. He thought I was already defeated. But he was wrong. If he had spent years planning my downfall, I would spend every ounce of strength planning his. I needed help. I needed someone who could see what I couldn't. So I walked into a lawyer's office expecting to hear that I had already lost everything. Instead, I found the one thing Marcus never saw coming, the hidden clause that would change everything. Walking into Margaret Willis' office that day felt like dragging the weight of my entire life behind me. My chest was tight, my palms were clammy, and the folder in my hands seemed heavier than bricks. Inside were the documents Marcus had placed before me, as if they were nothing more than a formality or prenup, the divorce settlement, mortgage papers, financial statements, all the little slips of paper I had signed in blind faith. They were my mistakes in black and white. And as I sat there, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had walked myself into a trap and locked the door from the inside. The office was small but warm, lined with books that smelled of dust and wisdom. Framed photographs of smiling children and family vacations softened the edges of the shelves, making it feel less like a battleground and more like someone's home. Yet in my heart, it was a battlefield. I sat on the edge of the chair, my body stiff, ready for judgment. Margaret was nothing like I expected. Not cold, not distant. She had sharp eyes, streaks of gray in her hair, and a voice that carried both calm and authority. When she leaned forward and said, "Tell me everything," something in me cracked open. And so I told her, the fairy tale, the whirlwind romance, the gifts that dazzled me into submission, the cracks that had turned into chasms, the humiliating comments, the endless nights alone, the cruel laughter on that phone call when Marcus bragged about using me, about cashing out, about taking my father's land as though it were a trophy he'd won. Every word poured out of me like water breaking through a dam, and by the time I finished, my throat was raw and my hands were shaking. Margaret didn't interrupt. She didn't pity me. She just listened, her eyes steady and unflinching, as though she'd been waiting her whole life to hear this exact story. And then, when I had nothing left to say, she pulled the folder toward her and began to read. The sound of pages turning was unbearable. Each shift of paper felt like the ticking of a clock, counting down to my destruction. She scribbled neat notes in the margins of her pad, her brow furrowed deeper with each section she scanned. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. I wanted her to look up, to give me hope, to tell me there was something, anything I had missed. But for a long time, she said nothing. Finally, she lowered the paper slightly and met my eyes. Sarah, she said quietly, this isn't good. He's been careful. The house, the accounts, your father's land, it's all structured to give him control. He's laid a careful trap. The words cut me open. My breath hitched. I whispered, so that's it. I lose everything. She raised her hand, stopping me. I didn't say that. Her tone sharpened, as if drawing a blade from its sheath. She flipped further into the prenup, eyes moving quickly, her lips pressing into a thin line. For a moment, her expression shifted. Her brow smoothed, her mouth twitched, not pity, but something else. Recognition. I leaned forward, barely breathing. What is it? Margaret tapped her pen against a paragraph, highlighted it, and slid the paper toward me. Clause 19. Subsection C. The words blurred in front of me. Dense, lifeless legalese, numbers and phrases that looked like another language. I don't understand, I whispered. She locked her gaze on me, her voice deliberate, every syllable falling like a hammer. It says that in the event of fraud, misrepresentation, or infidelity, this prenup is null and void, meaning it vanishes, meaning the court reverts to standard law, meaning Sarah, you're entitled to half of everything, the house, the accounts, the investments, and yes, your father's land. The words hit me like a thunderclap. For weeks, I had lived under the certainty of loss. I had believed Marcus' smug grin when he said I would walk away with nothing. But now, in one line of forgotten legal boilerplate, the scales tipped. I gripped the arms of the chair, my knuckles white, my voice trembling. Half of everything? But how do we prove fraud? Margaret's lips curved in the faintest hint of a smile. You overheard him bragging on the phone, didn't you? About how he tricked you? About how he planned to strip you of your father's land? That's fraud. We strengthen it with financial records, testimony, patterns of behavior. Marcus is arrogant. Arrogant men always leave trails. Well, find them. Hope surged in me, fragile but powerful, like a candle flame in the dark. My blood hummed. For the first time since this nightmare began, I didn't feel like prey. I felt like someone who had a weapon. But Margaret's eyes sharpened. Her voice lowered, urgent. You must be careful. He cannot know about this, not yet. If he suspects, hell cover his tracks. Hell twist the story. Hell prepare. So you need to play small. Let him believe you're broken. Smile when he smiles. Nod when he talks. Sign nothing. Because when the time comes, I want him standing on the edge of a cliff he built himself, and I want him to fall before he even knows the ground is gone. Something inside me shifted. The Sarah who had shrunk at dinner parties, who had swallowed her pain while strangers laughed, who had believed she was nothing but just a teacher, started to fade. In her place rose the woman my father had raised, the woman who knew her worth wasn't measured by a man's approval. I nodded, my voice firmer than I expected. I can do that. Margaret's eyes softened. You already are. Don't forget that. He underestimated you. Let him. She closed the folder with a sharp snap. That sounded less like the end of a conversation and more like the loading of a gun. When I walked out of her office, the world looked different. The air felt sharper, the light brighter. I was still trapped in a marriage that was collapsing, still facing a man who had plotted my ruin, but I carried something he didn't know existed, a secret clause that could destroy him. That night, I played my part. I set the table. I poured the wine. I smiled at his stories. To him, I was the broken, naive wife who didn't know what was coming. But inside, I was laughing at the man who thought he had stripped me bare, who thought his trap was airtight, because buried in the pages of his own weapon was the one thing that would undo him. And when the judge read that clause aloud, Marcus' empire would crumble not because I was powerless, but because I had been underestimated. And the next time we met, it would be in a courtroom where Marcus believed he had already won. What he didn't know was that a single hidden clause was about to burn his victory to ash. The morning of the hearing felt like the longest of my life. I woke before dawn, staring at the ceiling as shadows crept across the walls like silent warnings. My stomach churned, my hands trembled, and every breath caught halfway in my chest. The thought hammered in my mind over and over. This is it. Today decides everything. I barely touched breakfast. Even water felt heavy in my throat, as if swallowing it would anchor me to the fear trying to drag me under. When I dressed, I caught sight of myself in the mirror, pale skin, tired eyes, a face marked by sleepless nights. But buried deep in that reflection was something else, something small but unshakable, a spark, a flicker of fire that hadn't been there weeks ago. Marcus thought I was broken. He thought I would shuffle into that courtroom defeated. He thought I had already surrendered, but he didn't know what Margaret and I knew. He didn't know about the clause. I held on to that thought like a lifeline as Margaret arrived to drive us to the courthouse. She looked calm, collected, as though this was just another day at work, but when I climbed into her car, she gave me a small nod. "Remember," she said softly, her eyes steady on the road, "he thinks he's already won. That's our advantage." The courthouse loomed before us like a fortress. Its stone facade rose into the gray morning sky, cold and unyielding, as if carved from judgment itself. Inside, the ceiling soared high. The marble floors echoed with every step, and the air was sharp with authority. I clutched my bag so tightly my knuckles ached, forcing my legs to carry me forward even as my knees shook. Margaret walked beside me with steady strides, a rock in the storm, and I matched her step for step. When we entered the courtroom, my heart lurched painfully against my ribs. There he was, Marcus. He sat at the table across the room, his lawyer poised at his side. He looked immaculate, his best suit, crisp and dark with subtle pinstripes, a silk tie knotted perfectly at his throat. His shoes gleamed under the light, polished so thoroughly I could see faint reflections in them. His hair was combed into place, his jaw freshly shaven. He looked every bit the man in control. And when his eyes found mine, he smiled, that smug, calculated smile, the smile that had haunted me for years, the smile that once made me shrink into myself. It said without words, "I've already won. You're wasting your time showing up." My stomach twisted, but I straightened my back, lifted my chin, and sat tall beside Margaret. He could smirk all he wanted. He had no idea the ground beneath his feet was about to vanish. The courtroom filled slowly, clerks arranging files, bailiffs taking their positions, a handful of strangers waiting for other cases. The air buzzed with the quiet shuffle of papers, the scratch of pens, the faint coughs and whispers that seemed magnified in the echoing chamber. I smoothed my skirt, pressing trembling hands flat against the fabric, willing myself to steady. My heart pounded as though it wanted to break free from my chest. And then the judge entered. She was a woman in her 60s, silver hair pulled tightly into a bun, her black robe flowing like a shadow as she ascended the bench. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her presence alone demanded silence. The room stilled as she adjusted her glasses, glanced down at the file before her, and spoke. "We're here today to finalize the divorce proceedings between Marcus Chen and Sarah Chen. I understand there are disputed assets. Counsel, you may proceed." Marcus' lawyer rose first, buttoning his jacket with a practiced grace. He was every bit the polished professional sleek suit, smooth voice, confidence sharpened by years of courtroom victories. "Your Honor," he began, his tone calm, deliberate, almost condescending, "my client has gone above and beyond in this matter. Despite being the sole contributor to the marital assets, the home, the vehicles, the investment account, she has offered Mrs. Chen a generous settlement to assist her in beginning her new life. The prenuptial agreement clearly outlines the division of assets, but my client has chosen to be fairer than required. He has no desire to leave Mrs. Chen destitute." He glanced toward me, lips curving in a polite but dismissive smile. "Mrs. Chen is a teacher. A noble profession, of course, but not one that contributed significantly to the household finances. The lifestyle enjoyed during the marriage was funded almost entirely by Mr. Chen's hard work and success. His offer is more than reasonable given the circumstances." The words stung even though I'd heard them countless times before. Just a teacher. Marcus had sharpened that phrase into a blade over the years, slicing me down until I believed it. My fists clenched under the table, nails digging crescents into my palms. Across the room, Marcus smirked again, eyes locked on mine. daring me to flinch. When his lawyer finished, Margaret rose. She didn't smooth her jacket, didn't flash theatrics. She didn't need to. Her presence shifted the very air calm, sharp, unshakable. Your Honor, she began, her voice clear and steady, while opposing counsel paints a picture of generosity. The truth is far more sinister. The so-called settlement offered to my client would strip her of nearly every asset, including land she inherited from her late father. This is not fairness. This is exploitation. It is theft disguised as kindness. Marcus's lawyer scoffed, waving his hand as though brushing away an annoyance. The prenuptial agreement is airtight, Your Honor. There is no dispute here. Margaret's gaze cut to him, cold and sharp as steel. On the contrary, there is a very clear dispute, one that lies within the prenuptial agreement itself, a clause that Mr. Chen and his counsel appear to have overlooked. The judge raised her brows, interest sparking in her eyes. Proceed. Margaret reached into her briefcase and lifted the prenup, its pages tabbed and highlighted with precision. She handed it to the bailiff, who carried it to the bench. Silence fell, broken only by the rustle of paper as the judge flipped through the pages. Page 19, subsection C, Margaret said firmly. I believe it's best read aloud. Across the room, Marcus shifted. His smug confidence faltered. He leaned toward his lawyer, whispering urgently, his lips tight. His lawyer flipped through his copy of the prenup with frantic hands, his polished composure cracking as his eyes darted back and forth. The judge adjusted her glasses and began to read, her voice deliberate, each word like a hammer blow. In the event of fraud, misrepresentation, or infidelity, this prenuptial agreement shall be considered null and void, and marital assets shall be divided according to state law. The words exploded into the room like thunder. For a moment, silence. Then I saw it, the exact second Marcus' world collapsed. His face drained of color, his jaw locked tight, his smirk shattered into raw panic. His lawyer froze, eyes wide, lips parting as though hoping the page might magically rewrite itself if he stared long enough. Margaret's voice cut cleanly through the silence. Your Honor, my client overheard Mr. Chen bragging about deceiving her into signing documents she did not understand. He laughed about leaving her with nothing, despite using her father's land as collateral. That is fraud. That is misrepresentation. And we have additional documentation of financial transfers, Mr. Chen orchestrated transfers, that moved assets solely into his name, often under misleading pretenses. The judge's eyes snapped to Marcus. Mr. Chen, how do you respond to these allegations? Marcus shot to his feet, face blazing red, sweat glistening at his temple. This is a lie. Absolutely false. She's making this up to steal from me. Sit down, Mr. Chen, the judge barked, her voice cracking through the courtroom like a whip. He froze, chest heaving, then lowered himself back into his chair with jerky movements. His glare burned into me, venomous and sharp, but it no longer pierced. Not here, not now. Margaret stood firm, her voice calm and steady. Fraud doesn't need to be shouted from the rooftops, Your Honor. It's in the details. And in this case, the details paint a clear picture. This prenuptial agreement is void. The judge leaned back in her chair, tapping her pen against the document. The silence stretched, heavy, suffocating. Then she spoke, her words final and absolute. This agreement is not enforceable. Fraud has been alleged and supported with substantial evidence. By law, the prenuptial agreement is void. Mrs. Chen is entitled to half of all marital assets. My breath caught in my chest. Half of everything. The house, the investments, the accounts, and most importantly, my father's land. Marcus erupted. He slammed his fist on the table so hard the sound echoed off the walls, papers scattering like startled birds. This is insane. You can't do this. I built this life. I earned it. She was nothing before me. The judge's eyes blazed. Enough, Mr. Chen. One more outburst and I will hold you in contempt of court. The room fell silent again. So quiet I could hear the ticking of the clock on the wall. My chest heaved, not from fear this time, but from the tidal wave of victory crashing through me. The secret Margaret and I had guarded, the clause Marcus never even noticed, had turned the tables completely. Margaret placed a steady hand on my shoulder and delivered her final words. Your Honor, my client was underestimated. She was deceived, but she was not powerless. And today, thanks to the very contract Mr. Chen thought would protect him, justice has prevailed. The judge nodded, her voice ringing like the closing of a chapter. Court is adjourned. The gavel came down with a sharp crack. The sound reverberated through the courtroom like thunder, final and inescapable. And as it echoed, I looked across the aisle and saw Marcouche's mouth slightly open, his face pale, his eyes wide with disbelief. He looked like a man watching his empire crumble brick by brick, powerless to stop it. For the first time in years, the power wasn't his, it was mine. But Marcus wasn't finished. Outside that courthouse, he tried one last time to claw back control. What he didn't realize was that the woman who once believed his lies no longer existed. And this time, I had the final word. The sharp crack of the gavel still echoed in my bones as I stepped out of the courtroom. It was strange how such a small sound could carry so much weight, how it could slam the door on years of lies and open another door to freedom in the very same instant. My legs felt unsteady, almost as though I were learning how to walk again. My lungs burned with the sharp reminder of how long I had been holding my breath. For years I had been suffocating in silence, and with that single strike, I was free. Margaret walked beside me, calm and steady, her footsteps purposeful against the marble floor. She didn't smile, she didn't need to. Her quiet strength told me everything. She leaned toward me as the crowd spilled into the hallway and whispered, "You did it. You held your head high. He never got to see you break. That's victory, Sarah." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to feel victorious, to feel powerful, to feel untouchable. But the truth was, I felt hollow. My heart still pounded violently in my chest. My throat ached from holding back the sobs that had threatened to burst out as the judge read that clause aloud. Relief mixed with exhaustion, pride tangled with grief, joy clashed with disbelief. My emotions spun so wildly I could barely keep them straight. The hallway around me was alive with sound, shoes clicking against the floor, papers shuffling, whispers bouncing off the tall ceilings. People moved around me like a river, flowing forward with their own burdens and battles, barely noticing the storm still raging inside me. For them, it was just another day in court. For me, it was the end of a war. And then, cutting through all that noise, came a voice I knew too well. Sarah. I froze. The sound of my name, spoken in that sharp, commanding tone, clawed through me like a cold hand on my spine. Instinct told me to shrink back, to brace myself, to let the fear swallow me whole. That was what I had done for years whenever Marcus called my name like that, but not today, not anymore. I turned slowly. There he was, pushing through the crowd like a storm. Marcus. His face was pale, drained of the smug confidence he had worn like armor in that courtroom. His suit was still sharp, but his tie had slipped. His hair was slightly disheveled. For the first time since I had known him, he looked less like the polished banker and more like a desperate man. His lawyer trailed behind him, head down, already defeated, but Marcus' eyes burned with fury. Before I could step back, his hand clamped down on my arm. His grip was hard, almost frantic, pulling me toward him. His voice dropped into a harsh hiss. "We need to talk." I ripped my arm away, my voice slicing through the air. "Don't touch me." People slowed, heads turned. No one stopped, but I felt their eyes. I felt the weight of strangers witnessing what they didn't understand. Marcus noticed it too, his jaw tightened, and his voice softened, feigning calm, but the poison still seeped through every word. "This is a mistake," he whispered, his words quick and clipped. "The judge doesn't know us. She doesn't know what we've built. We can fix this, Sarah. You and me, we can still make this work." For a moment, I almost laughed. The audacity. After years of lies, after the smug grin he wore while trying to rob me blind, after watching his empire crumble in front of the judge, he thought he could pull me back with words. "Make this work?" My voice shook, but not with weakness. Rage swelled inside me, hot and raw, giving my words strength. "You spent years tearing me down. You lied, you cheated, you laughed. about how easy it was to control me. And now, after everything, you want me to believe this was some kind of misunderstanding? His face flickered, panic, then realization. His voice cracked. You heard that? I stepped closer, my voice low and sharp, meant only for him. I heard every word. The night you called me boring, ordinary, the night you bragged about cashing out of our marriage like it was a business deal, the night you told your friend you deserved an award for pretending to love me. I heard it all, Marcus. Every single word. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. For once, Marcus, the man who always had the perfect line, the clever retort, the cutting remark, was speechless. His lips quivered, his eyes darted, but nothing came. Finally, he tried again, his voice trembling with desperation. Sarah, I made mistakes. I got caught up. I lost sight of what mattered. But I love you. I always did. I shook my head slowly, my voice steady and cold. No, you loved controlling me. You loved owning me. You loved feeling superior. But you never loved me. Not once. The words hit him like a slap. His face contorted, his grip tightening on the briefcase he carried until his knuckles turned white. His chest rose and fell too quickly, his breath sharp and uneven. His eyes darted around, searching for an opening, a crack, some way to twist the moment back into his control. But there was nothing left for him to twist. No lies left to spin, no mask left to hide behind. I straightened, lifting my chin, my voice strong enough to cut through the buzzing hallway. You once told me I was nothing without you, that I should be grateful you married me, that a simple teacher should thank her lucky stars a man like you even looked at her. And for too long I believed you. I let you make me small. I let you convince me I was lucky. But today, I remembered something you never understood. His sneer returned, his voice dripping with venom. And what's that? That I was never small to begin with? I said firmly. My voice didn't shake. You may have stolen my time. You may have tried to take my father's land. You may have tried to strip me of everything I owned, but you never broke me. You never could, and you never will. For a long moment, silence stretched between us, heavy and unyielding. His lips trembled, his eyes widened, his chest heaved. I could almost see the wheels spinning in his head, desperately searching for the weapon he had always used against me, words. But for once, Marcus had none. He spat the only thing left in him, his voice low and bitter. You think you won because of some technicality? Because of a stupid clause? I leaned in, my words sharp and final. No, Marcus. I won because I finally saw you for what you area fraud. A coward. A man so hollow he has to crush others to feel powerful. You thought you'd take everything from me, but all you did was set me free. I stepped back then, breaking the invisible chain that had bound me to him for years. My voice rose, strong and unflinching. Goodbye, Marcus. And I turned. My heels clicked against the marble, each step echoing like a declaration. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. For the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of him. For the first time, he wasn't the center of my world. He was just a man in a hallway watching me walk away. The courthouse doors swung open and sunlight spilled across my face. The air outside was fresh, sharp in my lungs, filling me in a way I hadn't felt in years. I tilted my head back and closed my eyes, letting it wash over me. It felt like stepping into a new life. Margaret joined me a moment later, her footsteps steady, her presence grounding. She placed a hand on my shoulder, her voice quiet but certain. You did it. Tears blurred my vision, but I smiled through them, my chest heaving with a joy I hadn't felt in so long. No, I whispered, my voice breaking but free. We did it. But deep down, I knew this wasn't just about winning in court. This wasn't just about money or property. This was about reclaiming myself. This was about remembering that my worth had never been in Marcus' hands, no matter how hard he tried to convince me it was. He had underestimated me. He had mocked me. He had tried to erase me. But in the end, the woman he called ordinary was the one who stood in the sunlight, free, while he drowned in the shadows of his own greed. And as I walked down those courthouse steps, each stride steady and sure, I knew the truth. He had taken everything he thought mattered, but what he could never take, what he never even understood, was me. The days after the divorce felt strangely quiet. For so long, my life had been filled with conflict, fear, and the constant thrum of Marcus' voice in my ear. His presence had been everywhere, in the sound of his phone buzzing at all hours, in the clipped tone he used when he dismissed me, in the echo of slammed doors that seemed to rattle through my bones long after they'd closed. Now that it was over, I woke up each morning to silence. At first, it was unsettling. I would roll over in bed, expecting to see him there, expecting to hear the jingle of his cufflinks as he dressed for work, or the sharp tapping of his shoes across the floor. But there was nothing, just the sound of my own breathing, the soft morning light spilling across the floor, and the gentle hum of a world that finally belonged to me. It took time for the reality to sink in. I was free. No more lies, no more manipulation, no more living under the weight of a man who saw me as something to own rather than someone to love. But freedom brought its own challenges. There were moments when the silence felt like a punishment, when it was too heavy, too empty, when the ghosts of his words crept back into the corners of my mind. Just a teacher, boring, ordinary. The insults came back like echoes in a hollow room, taunting me in the dark. And each time, I had to remind myself that those words had never been truths. They were weapons he had used to keep me small, chains he had wrapped around me, chains I had broken. One of the first things I did was move out of the house. I couldn't stay there, it was soaked in memories. Every corner seemed haunted by something Marcus had said or done. The dining room where he mocked me in front of his colleagues, the bedroom where I lay awake beside him, silently crumbling, the study door that I once stood outside of when I heard his betrayal through the crack. Selling my share of the house wasn't hard. Walking away from it felt like shedding skin that had grown too tight, like stepping out of a prison cell into open air. I rented a modest apartment on the edge of town. At first it was bare, just walls and echoes, but every corner whispered possibility. It was mine, my keys, my locks, my door. I painted the bedroom a soft shade of blue, the kind of color Marcus would have sneered at as too plain. I furnished it slowly with second-hand pieces that carried warmth rather than status. A mismatched sofa that was too comfortable to ever impress anyone. A bookshelf that leaned slightly but held every novel I loved. A quilt I picked up from a thrift store, stitched with bright patches of fabric that seemed to tell stories of their own. Little by little, the space transformed into a home, not one filled with control and showmanship, but with peace, laughter, and a quiet kind of freedom. The land my father left me remained untouched for a while, but one Saturday I drove out there alone. The road curved through hills and fields until I reached the weathered barn that stood like a sentinel against time. The sky stretched wide above me, and the wind rushed across the grass like a living thing. I stepped out of the car and stood there, letting the air wash over me. For the first time in months, I felt something deep and grounding. This land was mine, not because of Marcus, not because of the courtroom, but because of my father, because he had believed in me, trusted me, and left me something unshakable to stand on when everything else collapsed. I walked through the barn, my fingers trailing across the rough wood, inhaling the scent of dust and earth that reminded me of childhood summers. I thought of my father, the way his hands were always rough, his voice always steady, his love quiet but unshakable. He had never been a man of wealth, but his kind of wealth was different. He had saved carefully, thought wisely, and passed on strength in ways that Marcus had never understood. Standing there, I whispered into the empty air, "I'm okay, Dad. I made it." The words trembled as they left my lips, carried away by the wind, but they felt real. For the first time in a long time, I believed them. Back in town, I returned to teaching. The first day back in my classroom after the divorce was surreal. My students didn't know the details of my life, but they sensed something had changed. They looked at me differently, with wide eyes that seemed to notice the way I carried myself now. They saw a woman who walked taller, who smiled more easily, whose laughter rang truer. They saw a woman who had been bent but not broken, and in their questions, their curiosity, their endless energy, I found purpose again. Marcus could take money, he could take time, but he could never take the joy of watching a student's eyes light up when they finally understood something. He could never take the impact I had on those kids' lives. That was mine, and always would be. Still, the nights were the hardest. Sometimes I would sit at my small kitchen table, a cup of tea cooling in my hands, staring out the window as the world darkened. That's when the doubts crept in, the shame, the worry that maybe Marcus had been right, that maybe I really was just ordinary, that maybe I would always be alone. But then I would close my eyes and remember. I would remember the courtroom. I would remember the way his face collapsed when the judge read that clause aloud. I would remember Margaret's calm voice, steady and powerful, reminding me that I had strength. I would remember my father's words stitched into my soul. Your worth isn't in what you own. Your worth is who you are when no one else is watching. And I would push the doubts away. I also started therapy. At first, I felt ashamed, as though admitting I needed help meant I was weak. But therapy wasn't weakness, it was courage. Sitting across from someone and speaking my pain out loud, peeling back the layers of manipulation and fear, was one of the bravest things I had ever done. Week after week, I untangled myself from Marcus' shadow, and slowly, piece by piece, I stitched myself back together. Not into the woman I had been before Marcus, but into someone stronger, wiser, freer. Margaret and I stayed in touch. She became more than my lawyer, she became a friend, a reminder of what it felt like to have someone in my corner. One evening, she came over for dinner at my apartment. We sat at my small table, sipping wine, laughter spilling between us. At one point, she leaned in and asked, "Do you know what your father really gave you, Sarah?" I frowned, thinking of the land, the financial safety, the legacy. But she shook her head gently. Not just money, not just land. He gave you the power to walk away. He built a safety net so no man could ever trap you. He didn't just protect your future, he gave you freedom. Her words cracked something open inside me. Tears spilled down my cheeks, but they weren't tears of sorrow. They were gratitude. My father had seen me in a way Marcus never could. He had believed I was strong enough to survive, strong enough to rise. As the months passed, I noticed the fear fading. The bitterness softened into something quieter, like an old scar you no longer flinch to touch. Marcus became a shadow, someone I used to know, someone who no longer held power over me. I stopped wondering what he was doing, stopped caring whether he had found someone else to control. His story no longer mattered, because for the first time in years I had my own. One evening, I returned to my father's land. The sun was setting in a blaze of gold and orange across the horizon, painting the fields with fire. The barn stood tall in the fading light, weathered but unbroken, just like me. The wind rustled through the grass, carrying with it the sound of freedom, the sound of a new life. I closed my eyes and felt the earth beneath my feet steady and solid, and I realized something profound. Marcus had tried to take everything. He had tried to erase me, to control me, to convince me I was nothing. But I had survived. More than that, I had risen. And as the sky darkened and the first stars pricked through the velvet night, I whispered the truth out loud. The truth I had fought so long to reclaim. I was never small. I was never ordinary. I was always enough. That was the real victory. Not the money, not the house, not even the land. The victory was remembering who I was all along. The victory was finally knowing that no one, not Marcus, not anyone could ever take that from me again. Freedom is a strange thing. At first, it felt like empty space, vast, uncharted, and even frightening. For so long, my life had been lived within invisible walls. Marcus' voice had been the gatekeeper of my choices, his moods dictating whether I felt safe, his approval deciding whether I felt worthy. When those walls finally collapsed, when the gavel struck and I walked away no longer bound to him, I found myself blinking into a silence so wide it almost scared me. But slowly, that silence transformed. It no longer felt like a void. It felt like air rushing into lungs that had been starved for years. It felt like a possibility. It felt like the open sky after a storm, clearing into something new, something vast. For the first time in years, my life was mine to shape, and the thought both terrified and electrified me. At first, my new dreams were small. I painted the kitchen in my apartment a cheerful yellow, a color Marcus would have called cheap and tacky. I bought myself fresh flowers every Sunday, letting their scent fill my living room as a reminder that beauty didn't need a reason to exist. I allowed myself afternoons curled up with a book, letting hours slip by without apology, without guilt. Each of those small acts felt radical, like pieces of my voice returning after years of being silenced. But those small acts grew into bigger ones. I started exploring again day trips to towns I'd never visited, walks through bustling markets where I tasted food Marcus would have mocked, hikes up hills where the wind carried away every trace of him from my memory. I sat alone at cafes, sipping coffee and scribbling in journals, learning to love my own company. I chased sunsets and didn't need anyone's permission to find them beautiful. And with every step, every choice, I reminded myself, I am here. I am alive. I am free. Teaching, too, became something more than a job. It became a rebirth. When I returned to the classroom, my students sensed it instantly. They saw it in the way I walked taller, the way my laughter came easier, the way I lit up when they succeeded. One afternoon, a little girl raised her hand, not with a question, but with a simple observation. "Miss Sarah," she said softly, "you look happy now." The words caught me off guard, struck me with their innocent honesty. And she was right, I was happy. Maybe not all the time, maybe not without scars, but happy in a way I had never been with Marcus. My students didn't know the details, but they felt the truth. I was no longer shrinking. I was expanding like sunlight filling a room. Of course, healing wasn't perfect. There were nights when his voice crept back in like a ghost, whispering those same poisonous words. Ordinary. Just a teacher. Lucky I even looked at you. On those nights, I drove to my father's land. I would stand in the open field as the wind whipped across the tall grass, looking at the old barn that still stood despite weather, time, and decay, weathered, scarred, imperfect but unbroken, just like me. Standing there, I reminded myself of what Marcus could never take, my resilience, my roots, my worth. And sometimes I whispered to my father as though he could hear me, I made it. I survived. In those moments, I could almost feel him near, the steady man who had taught me that worth is not in money or power or control, but in the quiet strength of who you are when no one else is watching. Life began to expand in other ways, too. One crisp autumn afternoon, I hosted people in my home for the first time. Nothing fancy, nothing stage, just colleagues and friends crowded into my modest apartment, mugs of cider warming their hands, mismatched chairs pulled around a table overflowing with baked goods. We laughed until our stomachs ached, voices bouncing off the walls, filling my home with a joy I hadn't realized I'd been starving for. The imperfection of it, the chipped plates, the leaning bookshelf, the secondhand sofa was perfect to me because it was real, because it was mine. That night, when the last guest left and silence returned, I stepped out onto my balcony. The stars stretched endlessly above me, scattered across the velvet sky. I wrapped a blanket around my shoulders, breathing in the crisp night air, and for the first time in years, I felt at peace. For so long, my life had been about survival, about clawing back pieces of myself from Marcus' grasp. But now survival wasn't the end, it was the beginning. I whispered it into the night, my voice steady, strong. This is only the beginning, because it was. Marcus had taken what he could. He had lied, manipulated, controlled, and underestimated me. He tried to strip me of everything to convince me I was nothing without him, but in the end, all his schemes had only revealed the truth, that I was stronger than he ever imagined. I had walked out of that courtroom with more than land, more than half the assets, more than legal victory. I had walked out with myself, and that more than anything was the final word.